Battle. The humans weren't just adapting to our technology. The Dar, Crixina, arrived to find Veltar sitting motionless in his chair. He had been waiting for her, but his eyes were unfocused and distant. When she sat down, he didn't acknowledge her presence for almost a full minute. "Commander, are you ready to continue?" "The withdrawal," he said quietly. "You want to know about the withdrawal? About how the mighty coalition fleet ran away from a primitive species that still used chemical rockets 6 months earlier? Tell me what happened." Veltar's voice was completely flat, as if he was reading from a technical manual. Admiral Mortex received direct orders from Coalition High Command on day 97 of the invasion. All forces were to evacuate the Terran system immediately. No exceptions. No delays. Full retreat to Coalition space. How did the fleet react to these orders? With relief, mostly. By that point, Coalition casualties had exceeded 80% of the original invasion force. Morale was completely destroyed. Most soldiers were afraid to leave their ships or bases, because human forces had demonstrated that nowhere in the system was truly safe. Dr. Crixina opened her tablet, but found her hands were shaking slightly. She had been conducting these interviews for weeks, and the accumulated horror was beginning to affect her as well. "The evacuation should have been routine," Veltar continued. "Standard procedure for withdrawing from hostile territory. Destroy any equipment that cannot be transported. Eliminate any intelligence that might be useful to enemy forces. Depart in organized formations with adequate security screening." But it wasn't routine. Nothing involving humans was ever routine. General Harper and Admiral Sullivan had been monitoring Coalition communications for weeks. They knew about the withdrawal orders before some of our own ship commanders did. The commander finally looked directly at the doctor, and she was shocked by what she saw in his eyes. Not just fear or trauma, but something deeper, a fundamental loss of faith in everything he had once believed about the nature of warfare and civilization. Harper coordinated the largest human military operation of the entire war. Every available ship, aircraft, and ground unit was mobilized for a simultaneous attack on all Coalition positions throughout the solar system, not to capture territory, but to prevent our withdrawal and seize as much Coalition technology as possible. They attacked during the evacuation. They attacked before the evacuation began. Human intelligence networks had identified the exact timing of our departure preparations. Sullivan's fleet moved to intercept Coalition ships before they could leave orbit, while Harper's ground forces assaulted every Coalition base simultaneously. Veltar stood and began his familiar pacing routine, but his movements were slower and more deliberate than before. The space battle was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Coalition doctrine calls for organized withdrawal under covering fire from designated rearguard units. Sullivan refused to allow any organized withdrawal. Her ships attacked individual Coalition vessels as they attempted to depart, forcing running battles throughout the entire solar system. How many Coalition ships escaped? Fewer than half. Sullivan's forces captured 67 Coalition vessels, intact, destroyed over 100 more, and forced the remainder to flee in disorder with minimal equipment and supplies. Dr. Crixina stopped writing. They captured Coalition warships, entire vessels with crews still aboard. Human boarding parties used captured Coalition teleportation technology to appear directly inside our ships. Coalition soldiers found themselves fighting hand-to-hand combat in their own corridors against humans who seemed to know the layout of Coalition vessels better than the crews themselves. The commander paused at the window and stared out at the garden, but his focus was clearly on memories from months before. The most terrifying part was the human boarding tactics. They didn't just overwhelm our defenses through superior numbers or weapons. They used psychological warfare that exploited specific fears of each Coalition species. What kind of psychological warfare? Humans had been studying captured Coalition personnel for months, learning about our cultural taboos, biological vulnerabilities, and individual psychological profiles. During boarding operations, they would use this information to create maximum terror and confusion. Veltar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They knew which species were afraid of enclosed spaces and would use that fear to control movement through ship corridors. They knew which species relied on group cohesion and would separate those individuals from their units. They even knew which species had religious or cultural restrictions that could be exploited during combat situations. How could they have gathered such detailed information? By treating captured coalition soldiers not as prisoners of war, but as research subjects. Human scientists like Dr. Alex Carter had been conducting behavioral and psychological studies on coalition prisoners for the entire duration of the conflict. Dr. Crixina realized she was holding her breath. What happened to the captured crews? Most were released after the human forces had extracted all useful information about coalition, technology, tactics, and strategic capabilities. But they were released, changed, psychologically conditioned to spread fear and uncertainty among coalition forces who had not yet encountered humans directly. Veltar returned to his chair but remained standing behind it, gripping the back with all four hands. The ground evacuation was even worse than the space battles. Coalition bases that should have been secured positions became death traps as human forces used captured coalition equipment to breach our defenses from directions we had thought were impossible. Can you describe a specific example? My own, based near what humans called Washington. We had received evacuation orders and were preparing to destroy sensitive equipment when Harper's forces attacked using our own teleportation technology. One moment we were securing classified materials. The next moment human soldiers were appearing throughout the facility. The commander's breathing was becoming labored again. The humans who attacked our base weren't regular military personnel. They were led by Colonel Ben Rodriguez, but his team included civilian scientists, engineers, and even medical personnel. They weren't just trying to kill coalition forces. They were conducting a comprehensive intelligence gathering operation. What were they looking for? Everything? Technical specifications for coalition weapons and vehicles. Strategic information about coalition military capabilities. Personal data about individual coalition species that could be used for future psychological warfare operations. Veltar finally sat down, but he immediately stood up again and resumed pacing. Rodriguez's team captured the base intact within 3 hours. They took prisoner every coalition soldier who survived the initial assault and subjected us to interrogation techniques that were somehow more effective than coalition methods, despite being much more primitive. What made human interrogation techniques so effective? They understood that different species respond to different types of pressure. Coalition interrogation methods are standardized because we assume that all intelligent species think in basically similar ways. Humans had learned that this assumption is completely wrong. The doctor looked at her extensive notes and realized they covered hundreds of pages. She had been documenting not just the military defeat of the coalition, but the complete failure of galactic civilization to understand an entirely different type of intelligent species. What happened after the evacuation was complete. The remaining coalition forces regrouped at the edge of the Terran system and waited for new orders from High Command. But those orders never came. Instead, we received reports that human ships had been detected near coalition worlds throughout the galaxy. The humans had begun expanding into coalition territory. Not just expanding, attacking. Human forces had used captured coalition navigation data to identify strategic targets throughout coalition space. Within weeks of our withdrawal from Earth, human raids had struck 3 coalition military bases and 2 civilian research facilities. Veltar stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the doctor's chair. Do you understand what this means? The species that we had come to pacify had become a threat to every world in coalition space. In less than 4 months, humans had evolved from a primitive planetary civilization to an aggressive interstellar power. Dr. Crixina closed her tablet and looked up at the broken veteran. What is the current situation between the Coalition and humanity? There is no current situation. Coalition High Command has declared Earth and all surrounding star systems to be a prohibited zone. No Coalition vessel is permitted to approach within 50 light-years of human territory. All contact with human forces is forbidden, and the humans have agreed to this arrangement. Veltar laughed, but the sound was hollow and bitter. Humans don't agree to anything, Doctor. They make demands. Ambassador Dan Walsh arrived at the Coalition capital 2 months ago with a list of requirements for what humans call a peace treaty. What kind of requirements? Full recognition of human territorial claims throughout their local galactic region, compensation for damages caused by the Coalition invasion, access to Coalition technology and scientific databases, and most disturbing of all, the right to establish human diplomatic and trade missions on Coalition. Dr. Crixina found Veltar curled up in the corner of the room when she arrived. He was rocking back and forth slowly, making a low humming sound that she had never heard from his species before. It took several minutes of gentle coaxing to get him back to his chair. "Commander, we can stop if you need to rest." "No," he said firmly. "You need to hear this. Everyone needs to hear this. The Coalition leadership still doesn't understand what we faced out there." She settled into her seat and waited for him to begin. Month 3 of the invasion. We had lost half our original force and all of our orbital manufacturing facilities. Admiral Zekron was demanding immediate reinforcements from the homeworlds. The High Command sent the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Mortek with orders to end the human resistance once and for all. Veltar's voice was steadier today, but his eyes kept darting toward the door. Mortek's fleet was 3 times larger than the original invasion force. 600 ships carrying the most advanced weapons in Coalition space. The Admiral was a veteran of 12 successful campaigns and had never lost a battle. He arrived at Earth confident that overwhelming force would break human resistance within days. What happened when the Fifth Fleet arrived? The humans were waiting for them. Not just Harper's ground forces, but Admiral Kate Sullivan commanding a fleet of human warships that shouldn't have existed. Dr. Crixina looked up from her notes. How many ships did the humans have? 200 vessels of various sizes. Most were converted civilian craft armed with captured Coalition weapons, but 40 were purpose-built warships constructed in the orbital facilities they had taken from us. The largest was Sullivan's flagship, a battleship that the humans had somehow built in less than 6 weeks. 6 weeks to build a battleship, using modular construction techniques that we had never seen before. The humans didn't build their ships the way we do, starting from the hull and working outward. They built standardized components that could be assembled quickly in space, then modified for specific missions. Veltar stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful gardens. Admiral Mortex made the same mistake that Admiral Zekron had made. He assumed that superior technology would guarantee victory. The Fifth Fleet approached Earth in standard battle formation, expecting the human ships to either flee or attempt surrender negotiations. But Sullivan had other plans. Sullivan had been studying Coalition naval tactics for months, using captured data from our ship computers. She knew exactly how Mortex would approach and had prepared accordingly. When the Fifth Fleet entered Earth orbit, they found themselves surrounded. The doctor stopped writing. Surrounded. How could a smaller fleet surround a larger one? By using the space around Earth itself as a weapon. Sullivan had positioned her ships throughout the orbital area using civilian space debris and captured Coalition stealth technology as camouflage. When Mortex arrived, human forces attacked from every direction simultaneously. Veltar turned back from the window, his expression grim. But the real shock wasn't the tactical surprise. It was the weapons the humans were using. They had taken our energy cannon designs and modified them in ways that violated every principle of safe engineering. Human weapons fired more rapidly, and hit harder than ours, but they also had a 50% chance of exploding and killing their own crews. Why would they build such dangerous weapons? Because humans value mission success over individual survival. A coalition weapons engineer would never design a cannon that might kill the operator. A human engineer only cares if the cannon destroys enemy ships before it fails. Dr. Crixina felt a chill as she realized the implications. The battle lasted 8 hours. At the end, Admiral Mortex had lost over half his fleet and was forced to withdraw to the outer system. Sullivan lost 60 ships and approximately 12,000 crew members, but she had achieved something that no species in Coalition history had ever done. What was that? She had defeated a Coalition fleet in open space combat using inferior numbers and improvised technology. The psychological impact on Coalition forces was devastating. Veltar returned to his chair, but remained on the edge, ready to move at any moment. After the space battle, everything changed. Human forces weren't just defending their planet anymore. They were actively hunting Coalition ships throughout their solar system. Sullivan's remaining vessels began attacking our supply convoys and communication relays. How did they coordinate these attacks? Through a human intelligence officer named Colonel Ben Rodriguez. During the second month of the invasion, Rodriguez's unit had been completely destroyed in a Coalition bombardment. We thought he was dead. We were wrong. The commander's hands began shaking again. Rodriguez had survived, with maybe 20 soldiers, and had been operating behind Coalition lines ever since. Not just conducting sabotage missions, but studying our operational procedures and identifying weaknesses in our command structure. What kind of weaknesses? Coalition military doctrine assumes that enemy forces will follow predictable patterns of behavior. Rodriguez exploited this by making his operations appear random, while actually following a carefully planned strategy to maximize psychological impact. Veltar was speaking faster now, his words tumbling over each other. Rodriguez's team would attack isolated Coalition outposts, capture the personnel alive, and then release them after psychological conditioning designed to spread fear and paranoia among our remaining forces. The captured soldiers would return to their units, telling stories about human capabilities that seemed impossible, but were completely true. Dr. Crixana looked up from her notes. What kind of stories? Humans who could fight for days without rest. Human soldiers who continued attacking, even after receiving wounds that should have been instantly fatal. Human commanders who seemed to predict Coalition tactical responses with perfect accuracy. Were these stories true? Every single one. Rodriguez had used captured Coalition medical technology to enhance human physical capabilities. Stimulants that allowed soldiers to function without sleep for extended periods. Pain suppressors that let wounded fighters continue combat operations. Even experimental treatments that accelerated healing and improved reflexes. The commander was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his claws were leaving scratches in the metal. But the worst part wasn't what Rodriguez was doing to our soldiers. It was what he was learning about our fleet operations. His intelligence network had infiltrated Coalition communications and was providing real-time tactical information to Sullivan's space forces. How did human infiltrators penetrate Coalition security? They didn't use infiltrators. They used our own technology against us. A human computer specialist named Dr. Emma Foster had captured intact Coalition communication equipment and spent weeks studying our encryption methods. Veltar was breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Foster didn't just break our codes. She learned to generate fake Coalition communications that our own systems couldn't distinguish from real messages. Human forces began receiving copies of all Coalition fleet communications, while our ships started receiving false orders that led them into ambush situations. The humans were controlling Coalition fleet movements. Worse than that, they were predicting our movements days in advance and preparing appropriate responses. When Admiral Mortex tried to regroup his remaining forces for another attack, He found that human ships were already waiting at every location he had planned to use. Dr. Crixina realized she had stopped taking notes and was simply listening, in fascination and horror. The breaking point came when Foster's team began broadcasting altered coalition communications back to our ships. Not just false orders, but computer viruses hidden in routine data transmissions. These viruses corrupted navigation systems, weapons targeting, and even life support controls. How many ships were affected? Nearly the entire Fifth Fleet. Within days, coalition vessels were experiencing massive systems failures. Ships would lose power without warning. Weapons would fire randomly. Navigation computers would generate false course information that sent vessels into asteroid fields or planetary gravity wells. Veltar stood up abruptly and walked to the door, then turned back to face the doctor. By the end of month 3, human forces weren't just winning the war, they were beginning to expand beyond their own solar system. Sullivan's ships had captured enough coalition technology to begin construction of faster-than-light vessels capable of reaching coalition territory. They were planning to invade coalition space. They were already doing it. Scout ships had been detected near 3 coalition worlds, and long-range sensors had picked up evidence of human construction activity in nearby star systems. The species that we had come to pacify was becoming a threat to galactic civilization itself. The room was silent for several minutes. Dr. Crixina looked at her extensive notes and realized that the story was even worse than the official reports had suggested. What did Coalition High Command decide to do? Veltar's mandibles clicked rapidly. They ordered full withdrawal from the Terran system and recommended that Earth be declared a prohibited zone for all Coalition vessels. They gave up panicked, for the first time in Coalition history. Our leadership faced an enemy that was not only winning, but getting stronger with every. Dr. Crixina walked into the white room carrying 2 cups of warm liquid. She placed one in front of Veltar and kept the other for herself. The commander looked worse than yesterday. His shell was dull, and his eyes were bloodshot. He had clearly not slept much. "Tell me about the first real battle," she said, settling into her chair. Veltar picked up the cup, but did not drink. His hands were shaking again. "Which one?" "The disaster at the Hudson River, the massacre in Central Park. Or maybe you want to hear about Times Square, where we lost an entire company in less than an hour. Start with whichever one you remember most clearly." The commander stared at the liquid in his cup. Day 4, we had established a perimeter around what the humans called Manhattan Island. 3,000 coalition troops holding defensive positions. We controlled all the bridges and tunnels. Our orbital support could target any human force that tried to approach. It should have been impossible for them to threaten us, but they found a way. They found dozens of ways. The first attack came from underground. Humans had been using tunnels under their city for over a century. Transportation tunnels, utility tunnels, maintenance tunnels. We knew about the major ones, but there were thousands of smaller passages we never detected. Dr. Crixina made notes while Veltar spoke. His voice was getting stronger, as if talking about the technical details helped him cope with the memories. The human leader was a military officer named Jake Morrison. According to our intelligence, he commanded maybe 50 soldiers, barely enough to pose any threat to our forces. What our intelligence failed to mention was that Morrison had spent his entire adult life studying warfare. What made him different from other human military leaders? Morrison understood that he could not win a direct battle against our technology, so he refused to fight one. Instead, he turned the entire city into a weapon against us. Veltar finally took a sip from his cup. His first attack targeted our communications array, not with energy weapons or explosives, but with something we never expected. What was that? Children. Human youngsters carrying what looked like recreational equipment. Toy aircraft controlled by radio signals. We thought they were civilians, trying to evacuate. so we let them approach our positions. The commander's voice grew bitter. Those toy aircraft were loaded with explosives made from household chemicals. They destroyed our primary communication relay and killed 12 coalition soldiers before we even realized we were under attack. Dr. Crixina stopped writing. Human children participated in combat operations, not just participated. They were essential to Morrison's strategy. Adult humans would have triggered our motion sensors and threat detection systems. But the children moved through the city using routes that only they knew about. Storm drains, building maintenance shafts, even the spaces inside the walls of larger structures. Veltar set down his cup and rubbed his temples. After the communication relay was destroyed, Morrison's forces attacked from 6 different directions simultaneously. But these weren't random attacks. Each one was precisely timed to force us into predetermined positions where other human forces were waiting. He was hurting your troops, like animals being driven to slaughter. Morrison had studied our standard tactical responses and predicted exactly how we would react to each attack. When we moved forces to defend the eastern perimeter, human troops were already in position to hit our western flank. When we called for orbital support, they jammed our targeting systems using our own captured equipment. The doctor could see that Veltar was becoming agitated. His breathing was faster, and his claws were digging into the metal armrests of his chair. The worst part was the psychological warfare. Morrison's troops had speakers hidden throughout the city, broadcasting coalition distress calls from units that had already been overrun. We kept trying to respond to requests for help from soldiers who were already dead. How long did this battle last? 14 hours. 14 hours of constant combat against an enemy who seemed to know our every move before we made it. By the end, we had lost 800 soldiers and most of our heavy equipment. Morrison's casualties were maybe 30 troops. Dr. Crix looked up from her notes. 30 humans defeated 800 coalition soldiers. 30 humans plus several thousand civilians who provided intelligence, supplies, and tactical support. Morrison had turned every human in the city into part of his military force. Shop owners reported our troop movements. Office workers manufactured improvised weapons. Even medical personnel treated wounded human fighters and sent them back into combat. Veltar stood and walked to the window again, but the real shock came when we tried to retreat. Morrison had anticipated that too. Human forces had seized control of all exit routes from the island, not to trap us, but to capture our equipment intact. They wanted your technology. They needed our technology, and they got it. 3 gravity disruptors, 12 energy rifles, 4 portable shield generators, and a complete field communication system, all captured in working condition. The commander turned back to face the doctor. Do you know how long it takes most species to understand coalition technology well enough to use it effectively? The average is 15 to 20 standard years. Morrison's engineers had our gravity disruptors operational within 6 hours. Within 12 hours, they had figured out how to recharge the power cells using their primitive electrical grid. By the end of the first day, they were manufacturing copies using materials scavenged from destroyed buildings. Dr. Crixina felt a chill run down her spine. How is that possible? Human brains work differently than other species. Where we see technology as something mysterious and complex, they see it as a collection of problems to be solved. They understand that all technology follows basic physical principles, and once they grasp those principles, they can adapt the technology to their needs. Veltar returned to his seat, but remained on the edge of the chair, as if ready to flee at any moment. The captured equipment was bad enough, but what Morrison did next changed everything. He started broadcasting technical specifications to other human military units around the planet. Not just the specifications, but detailed instructions on how to build improved versions using commonly available materials. He shared the information with other human forces. With all human forces. Morrison understood that individual victories were meaningless unless they contributed to the overall war effort. So he gave away every tactical and technological advantage his unit had gained. The doctor set down her tablet. That seems counterproductive. Why would he share information that gave him an advantage over other human forces? Veltar stared at her for a long moment. Because humans don't compete with each other when they face an external threat. They cooperate. Every human military leader understood that coalition technology in the hands of one unit was useful, but coalition technology in the hands of every unit was devastating. What happened next? Within 3 days, human forces around the planet were using modified coalition weapons. Within a week, they were building improved versions that were more effective than our originals. Morrison's battle in New York became a template that human commanders copied and improved upon in cities around their world. Veltar's voice dropped to almost a whisper. But the real nightmare was yet to come. Because Morrison wasn't content to just defend his city. He started planning offensive operations. Offensive operations against what? Against our fleet in orbit. Morrison had captured enough coalition technology to understand how our spacecraft worked, and once he understood that, he started building weapons that could reach us. Dr. Crix realized she was gripping her stylus tightly. Humans developed space combat capability during the invasion. In less than 2 weeks, using a combination of their existing rocket technology and captured coalition equipment. The first human spacecraft was a converted cargo vessel armed with improvised weapons. It should have been destroyed easily by our orbital defenses, but it wasn't. It crippled 2 coalition warships before we could react. The human pilot was a civilian named Kate Sullivan, who had learned to fly spacecraft by studying captured coalition navigation systems. She approached our fleet using a trajectory that our sensors couldn't track properly, attacked without warning, and escaped before our weapons could target her ship. Veltar finished his drink and set the empty cup on the table. After Sullivan's attack, Admiral Zekran declared a state of emergency and requested reinforcements from the coalition homeworlds. What had started as a simple pacification mission was becoming something else entirely. What was it becoming? A war? The first real war the coalition had fought in over 2 centuries. And we were losing. The room was silent for several minutes. Dr. Crixina reviewed her notes while Veltar sat motionless, lost in memories of a battle that had changed everything. He thought he knew about warfare. Finally, the doctor looked up. Tomorrow, we'll talk about what happened when the reinforcements arrived. Veltar nodded, but his expression was grim. Doctor, you should know something about those reinforcements. What's that? They didn't help. They just gave the humans more targets to practice on. Dr. Crixina entered the room to find Veltar already waiting. He had arrived early and was sitting perfectly still, staring at the wall. When she sat down, he didn't acknowledge her presence for several seconds. "Commander," she said softly. "I was thinking about General Lisa Harper," he replied without looking at her. She was the human who taught us that we weren't fighting a planet. We were fighting an entire species that had turned warfare into a science. Tell me about her. Velt finally turned to face the doctor. Harper took command of human forces 3 weeks into the invasion. Before that, human resistance had been scattered and uncoordinated. Effective, but limited to local areas. Harper changed everything. How? She connected every human military unit on the planet into a single network, not through advanced technology, but through simple communication methods that we couldn't intercept or disrupt. Human civilians carried messages between units. Radio operators used codes based on their own cultural references that our translators couldn't understand. Even their entertainment broadcasts contained hidden military instructions. Dr. Crixin opened her tablet and began taking notes. What made Harper such an effective leader? She understood something that coalition commanders had forgotten after centuries of easy victories. War isn't just about having better weapons. It's about using everything at your disposal to destroy your enemy's ability to fight. Veltar stood and began pacing around the small room. Harper didn't just command military forces. She commanded the entire human population. Factory workers, scientists, teachers, medical personnel, even children. Everyone had a role in her war machine. Can you give me an example? The Battle of Chicago. Coalition reinforcements had landed there with orders to establish a secure base of operations. 2 divisions of our best troops, supported by heavy armor and orbital bombardment capability. The human forces in that area were outnumbered 10-1 and had no heavy weapons. The commander's voice grew distant as he recalled the events. Harper didn't try to match our firepower. Instead, she turned the entire city against us. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a trap. Every civilian became a spy. What do you mean? The humans had weeks to prepare before we arrived. They evacuated most non-combatants, but those who remained were all part of Harper's plan. Shop owners knew exactly which routes our patrols would take and planted explosives accordingly. Office workers monitored our communications and reported our positions to human military units. Even children played a role by carrying supplies and messages through areas we couldn't patrol effectively. Dr. Crixana looked up from her notes. How did Harper coordinate such a complex operation? That's what made her so dangerous. She didn't try to control everything from a central location like coalition commanders do. Instead, she gave local leaders general objectives and let them figure out the details. Every human unit knew what they were supposed to accomplish, but they had complete freedom to choose their methods. Veltar stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair. Do you understand what that means? We were fighting an enemy where every individual soldier could think like a general, where every unit could adapt to changing conditions without waiting for orders from higher command. That must have made it very difficult to predict their actions. Impossible. We would develop tactics to counter one human approach, only to discover that they had already moved on to something completely different. Our intelligence officers went crazy trying to figure out human strategy, because there was no single strategy. There were thousands of strategies, all working toward the same goal. The doctor could see that Veltar was becoming agitated again. His breathing was faster and his claws were extended. The worst part of the Chicago battle was watching our own technology turned against us. Not just captured weapons, but completely new devices built from coalition components combined with human engineering. What kind of devices? A human scientist named Alex Carter had been studying medicine before the invasion. Within days of Harper taking command, Carter was leading a team that developed biological weapons, specifically designed to target coalition species, while leaving humans unharmed. Dr. Crixina felt a chill run down her spine. Biological weapons. Airborne agents that attacked our respiratory systems. Contact toxins that absorbed through our skin. Even modified bacteria that could survive in our food supply and cause systemic organ failure. Veltar's voice was barely above a whisper. Carter's team tested these weapons on captured coalition soldiers to make sure they were effective. That's a violation of all civilized warfare conventions. Humans don't follow civilized warfare conventions. They follow one simple rule: do whatever is necessary to win. Carter didn't see his biological agents as violations of ethics. He saw them as tools for species survival. Veltar returned to his seat but couldn't sit still. He kept shifting position and looking toward the door as if he wanted to escape. The biological weapons were bad enough, but Carter's team also developed something worse. Psychological warfare agents that affected our brain chemistry. Compounds that caused paranoia, depression, and crippling anxiety in coalition species. How did they deploy these weapons? Through our water supply, through our food, even through the air recycling systems in our vehicles and temporary shelters. Within days of Carter's weapons being deployed, coalition forces in Chicago were suffering. massive psychological casualties. Soldiers who had fought bravely for decades suddenly couldn't function in combat situations. Dr. Crixina realized she was taking notes very quickly, trying to keep up with Veltar's rapid speech. But Harper's real genius was logistics. While coalition forces depended on complex supply lines from orbit, human forces made everything they needed from local materials. They turned automobile factories into weapons manufacturing plants overnight. Research laboratories became centers for developing new forms of warfare. Even schools were converted into training facilities for new human soldiers. How could they reorganize their entire civilization so quickly? Because humans had been practicing for it without knowing it. Their economic system was already designed for rapid adaptation to changing conditions. Their educational system taught problem-solving and innovation from childhood. Their political structure allowed local communities to make decisions without waiting for central authority. Veltar was speaking faster now, as if he needed to get all the memories out before they overwhelmed him. I watched a human manufacturing facility convert from producing civilian vehicles to military equipment in less than 48 hours. The same workers, using the same machinery. But suddenly, they were making armored personnel carriers instead of passenger cars. And these weren't crude copies of coalition vehicles. They were improved designs that were better suited to human tactical doctrine. What made the human designs better? They understood that technology should serve strategy, not the other way around. Coalition weapons were designed to demonstrate superiority and force surrender through shock and intimidation. Human weapons were designed to kill as efficiently as possible with minimum resource expenditure. The commander rubbed his temples with two of his hands while gripping the chair arms with the other two. The final shock came when human forces began launching their own spacecraft, not just the converted cargo vessels that Kate Sullivan had been using, but purpose-built warships constructed in orbital facilities that humans had captured from us. They captured orbital facilities, 3 manufacturing stations, and 2 fuel depots. Human forces used a combination of captured coalition shuttles and their own improvised spacecraft to assault our orbital installations. The attacks were coordinated with ground operations that prevented us from providing support from the surface. Dr. Crixina set down her tablet. How is that possible? Your orbital facilities should have been heavily defended. They were defended, according to coalition standards. But humans don't fight according to coalition standards. They used tactics that we had never encountered and couldn't counter effectively. Simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, coordinated deception operations, and weapon systems that violated every principle of civilized space warfare. Veltar was shaking now, his entire body trembling with the memory of those battles. By the end of the second month, human forces were not just defending their planet, they were beginning to threaten coalition territory. Harper had turned a defensive war into an offensive campaign, and we had no idea how to stop her. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Veltar's labored breathing. Dr. Crixina looked at her notes and realized they covered dozens of pages. We'll continue tomorrow, she said gently. Veltar nodded but didn't move from his chair. Doctor, there's something else you need to understand about Harper and her war machine. What's that? They were just getting started. The white room smelled of cleaning chemicals and fear. Commander Veltar sat on the metal chair, his forearms folded tight against his chest. His brown shell had deep scratches running down the sides, and one of his 6 eyes twitched every few seconds. The fluorescent lights above made everything look pale and cold. Dr. Crixina checked her notes and looked across the table at the war veteran. She had seen many soldiers after battle, but none quite like this one. Veltar had been part of the Terran campaign, and the few who came back all showed the same signs. They jumped at loud noises. They couldn't sleep. They spoke in whispers, about things that didn't make sense. Tell me about Earth, she said, keeping her voice soft and steady. Veltar's mandibles clicked together 3 times. That was always a bad sign. His species only did that when they were very scared or very angry. Which part do you want to know about, Doctor? The part where we thought it would be easy, or the part where everything went wrong? Start from the beginning. Tell me about the mission briefing. The commander's good eye focused on something far away, as if he could see through the walls of the medical facility. Admiral Zekron called it a cleanup operation. Simple pacification of a primitive world. We had monitored their radio signals for 40 standard cycles. Chemical rockets, nuclear fission, kinetic projectile weapons. They were barely out of their home gravity well. Dr. Crixina made notes on her tablet. This part was in all the reports, but she needed to hear it from him. What were your orders? Standard procedure for Class 7 civilizations. Land near population centers. Display superior technology. Accept surrender. Integrate survivors into coalition workforce. Veltar's voice was flat, like he was reading from a manual. The whole operation was scheduled to take 3 rotations, maybe 4 if they were stubborn. How many ships did the coalition send? 200 vessels, 50,000 troops from 12 different species. The Cathani brought their plasma, artillery. The Vortok had gravity disruptors. The Silmari provided orbital support. He paused and looked directly at the doctor. We brought enough firepower to level continents, for a world that still used gunpowder and petroleum. Dr. Crixina could hear the bitterness in his voice. You were confident of victory. Confident. Veltar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Doctor, we had energy shields that could stop anything they had. Our weapons could cut through their strongest metals, like soft clay. We had fought 17 campaigns against primitive worlds. This was supposed to be number 18. What made you think humans would be different from other species? The commander's eye twitched again. Nothing. That was the problem. Every species we had encountered followed the same pattern. When faced with superior technology, they either joined us peacefully or surrendered after minimal resistance. The Cathani submitted after we destroyed one of their cities. The Vortok negotiated terms when they saw our fleet. Even the warrior clans of Silmar gave up fighting when they realized they couldn't win. But humans were different. Humans were impossible. Veltar stood up and walked to the small window. Outside, he could see the peaceful gardens of the medical complex. Other species are logical. They see overwhelming force and make reasonable decisions. They value their lives and the lives of their offspring. They understand when a fight cannot be won. Dr. Crixina waited. She had learned that pushing too hard made the veterans shut down completely. We monitored their communications during the approach. Their leaders knew we were coming. They could see our fleet on their primitive detection systems. Any rational species would have tried to negotiate, maybe offer tribute or resources in exchange for mercy. He turned back to face her. Do you know what the human leaders did instead? Tell me. They started building weapons, faster than should have been possible. Their entire civilization shifted into what they called a war economy within days of detecting our approach. Factories that made consumer goods were retooled to produce military equipment. Research facilities abandoned peaceful projects to work on new forms of destruction. Even their entertainment media began broadcasting instructions on guerrilla warfare and resistance tactics. The doctor made more notes. This surprised the coalition command. Surprised is too weak a word. It terrified them. But Admiral Zekron convinced himself it was just primitive posturing. He said that all species make desperate preparations when faced with invasion, but they always see reason once the shooting starts. Velta returned to his chair, but he couldn't sit still. His claws kept scratching at the metal armrests. The final intelligence briefing took place 12 hours before planet. The analysts showed us human military formations, scattered forces with obsolete equipment, no unified command structure, no orbital defenses worth mentioning. The Admiral joked that we might finish early and be home for the Festival of 3 Moons. When did you first realize something was wrong? During the landing approach. Other species usually panic when they see our ships. There's chaos in their communications. Leaders flee to safe locations. Military units scatter or desert. He was quiet for a long moment. Human communications became more organized as we got closer, more efficient. They weren't panicking. They were preparing. Dr. Krixana noticed that Veltar's hands were shaking slightly. What happened during the first landing? I was part of the New York assault group. 3,000 coalition troops landing in what humans called Central Park. Our intelligence said it was a recreational area in the middle of their largest population center. Perfect for a demonstration of overwhelming force that would break their will to resist. And did it work? Veltar's mandibles clicked rapidly. For the first 10 minutes, it seemed human civilians fled in all directions. Their local security forces took defensive positions, but didn't open fire immediately. Our translators broadcast surrender demands in their dominant language. Standard procedure. What went wrong? Nothing went wrong with our plan. The plan was perfect for fighting any rational species. He looked at his scarred hands. But humans aren't rational. Instead of their leaders coming forward to negotiate, their military forces began probing our defenses. Not desperate attacks, but careful, methodical tests of our capabilities. They were learning and adapting in real time. Within the first hour, they had figured out the frequency range of our energy shields. Within 2 hours, they were modifying their primitive weapons to exploit that information. By the end of the first day, human forces were using our own technology against us. Dr. Krixona set down her tablet. How is that possible? It takes most species decades to understand coalition technology. That's what we thought too. But humans don't think like other species. Where we see advanced technology as something to worship or fear, they see it as a puzzle to solve. They took apart our equipment, like children playing with toys. Except these children understood engineering principles that some coalition species still haven't mastered. The commander was breathing heavily now, his shell rising and falling with each breath. The worst part wasn't that they learned our technology. The worst part was that they improved it. Improved it how? Made it deadlier, more efficient, easier to manufacture with their primitive industrial base. A human engineer, named Jake Morrison, captured one of our gravity disruptors during the 3rd day of fighting. By the end of that same day, his unit had not only figured out how it worked, but they had built 12 copies, using parts from destroyed vehicles and commercial electronics. Dr. Krixana realized she was leaning forward, caught up in the story. Despite herself, what did Coalition Command do when they learned about this? Admiral Zekron declared it impossible. He said the reports had to be exaggerated, that primitive species cannot master advanced technology in days. He ordered the ground commanders to press the attack and finish the operation quickly, but the situation got worse. Veltar nodded slowly. Much worse. Because we weren't just fighting human military forces. We were fighting their entire species. Every human civilian became a potential combatant. Their elderly provided intelligence. Their young carried supplies and messages. Even their offspring helped build defensive positions. That must have been difficult for coalition forces to understand. Impossible to understand. Other species have warriors and civilians. Clear distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. Humans seem to view the entire conflict as a threat to their species' survival, and they responded accordingly. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the air recycling system. Dr. Krixina looked at her notes and realized they had been talking for over an hour. Veltar looked exhausted, but also relieved, as if he had been carrying these memories alone for too long. "We'll continue tomorrow," she said gently. "You've done well today." Veltar stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Doctor, there's something you need to understand about humans. Something that isn't in any of the official reports." "What's that?" "They enjoyed it.